Hi, Lou Pulsifer here, and I am going to talk about the evolution of Dungeons and Dragons and of RPGs. And this is going to be quite long, so it'll be two parts. Now, my intent is to give the truth. I was educated as an historian, so historians try to discover the truth, to see reality as it is. Wishful thinking plays no part, I hope. But nowadays, a lot of people are more into wishful thinking than the truth. I've lived through the RPG era as an adult gamer. It doesn't matter to me whether you like what I have to say or wish it were different. Moreover, keep in mind that offense is taken, not given. I don't intend to offend anyone, but if I do, so be it. Remember, there are usually exceptions to generalizations. I am and have to speak in generalizations. Well, in this first part of the two-parter, I'm going to talk mainly about the background and general trends, and then in the second part, I'll talk mainly about the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Keep in mind that Dungeons and Dragons, specifically in RPGs in general, popularized the avatar in games. The avatar represents you. Everything you do emanates from that avatar, and it's at risk of loss. If the avatar dies, you in effect die. You're out of the game. You lose the game, at least for a while. RPGs were founded by wargamers. Gradually, the proportion of wargamers, and then the proportion of gamers in general, has decreased among RPGers, while the proportion of fiction fans has increased. Many people may only play RPGs and not play any other kind of game, in other words, and that proportion, I believe, has increased as time has passed. And keep in mind, we're talking about more than 45 years. A big trend in RPGs is that consequence versus reward has varied over time. Consequences as in, you must earn what you get in the game. As time has passed, the trend is to reward participation rather than require players to earn their rewards. Well, consequences don't work well for most non-gamers who prefer not to be challenged by entertainment. Consequence involves challenge. So as time passes, RPGs tend to be more about reward and avoidance of the negative and less about consequences. Roleplay versus dice play. Character skills numbers didn't exist in D&D until the second edition and only came to the fore in the third edition. In play, rolling against skill numbers for success has gradually replaced role-playing of situations. This works better for passive than for active players. Now, wargamers are almost necessarily active players. People who are interested mainly in story are generally passive. That is, when you read or see a story, you're mostly or entirely passive. The active players, I suspect, are generally more willing to role-play a situation, whereas the passive players are just as happy to have a dice roll against their skill. Initially, role-playing in RPGs was about vicarious participation, putting yourself in the place of the character. More recently, it's often about acting. You're playing the character as someone other than yourself, which is quite different. The first method works well for wargamers. The second works well for non-gamers, story fans. The second also works better in a game that's more about participation than about earning something. The GM's role has changed over time. In general, you have the GM as God or creator of the world versus GM as rules arbiter. GM as creator is harder. Many people can't do it, others aren't willing to. To broaden the market, D&D moved toward GM as rules arbiter, that is, one who interpreted the rules. That's noticeable especially in the third edition. This required more detailed rules, so that there were rules that the GM could interpret. It also let their players get their way sometimes. The GM had to admit, yes, that's the way the rules are, even though it perhaps didn't work so well for the game. And that's especially true with a lot of add-on rules. And of course, all RPGs benefit and suffer from add-on rules. What about the video game influence? Well, video games owe a great deal to D&D. And when Gary Gygax died in 2008, there were many articles about that. But more recently, so many people are playing video games and video RPGs that this influences what they expect in tabletop RPGs. Keep in mind, you can't lose a single-player video game. Also, in many video games, no one dies permanently, they just respawn. Free-to-play games, F2P, means players must be rewarded so that they'll stay and continue to play the game until they finally spend some money. So more and more of the not really dangerous or respawning shows up in tabletop RPGs as time passes, because so many tabletop gamers are also video gamers. What about imagination? Well, as time passes, children use imagination less and less. Instead, they get high-quality graphics that show them exactly how things work. They get corporate games where the players follow the lead of the publishers of the game rather than use their imagination. When they get toys, they already know stories about how the toys are supposed to work, whether it's G.I. Joe or something else. It's not just, say, a bunch of race cars and you have to make up everything else. So over time, fewer GMs make up their own adventures, which also makes GMing easier. They use what's published, and that suits RPG publishers in two ways. One, that the GMing is easier, and two, that the people are buying the publisher's adventure modules. Now, when I discuss how the rules of various versions of D&D encourage a certain kind of play, we have to keep in mind that not everyone plays that way. But most folks naturally would play the way that the game encourages, don't you think? For example, 3rd edition could be played with 7-character parties and a cooperative attitude, but that's not what the designers intended. And I'll talk about that when I talk about 3rd edition. 4th edition didn't have to focus so heavily on combat, but there are few spells, few other things to do to help you outside of combat. So naturally the rules encourage combat. Now I'll talk about original D&D, and then in the second part we'll talk about the later editions. Original D&D was 3 paperback booklets in a box. I started playing with those plus Greyhawk in 1975, so I never played with just the 3 books. My impression is that the game was much like later games as published by Fantasy Flight Games, for example. Of course, D&D was published by TSR. Those FFG original games, it was said, weren't complete until the first expansion was issued to fix them. In a similar way, Greyhawk was the first expansion that had the same effect for Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the original version encouraged combined arms cooperation, which I'll talk more about next time, but it had a lack of clarity. Even though there were 4 booklets at that point, there's still a lot of short rules and rules that were unclear. It was kind of the Wild West of RPGs. But we'll talk more about such things in part 2. Thanks for listening.